Well, good morning, Jagandarana here. What superhit movies don't say about fighting terrorists? What superhit movies don't say about fighting terrorists? Dhurandhar offers a kind of undimensional response to real threats. Given its evident hold on popular imagination, this can end up constraining policy choices. Complexity is built into any response to terrorism. This is a particular kind of film that does not merely entertain but instructs. It teaches its audience how to feel, whom to fear, and what forms of power should be admired. So Dhundar belongs squarely to this category. It is not important because it's a spy thriller or even because it's a successful. It matters because it reveals how India now imagines conflict in the subcontinent and what kind of futures feel emotionally acceptable to its mass public. The film's word is simple: violence is cleansing, retaliation is virtue, complexity is weakness, terrorism is not a problem to be managed, constant, or prevented. It's an insult to be answered, preferably with blood. In this sense, Durandar is not a movie about counter-terrorism at all. It's a movie about the certainty, about the comfort of believing that force, applied decisively and without moral residue, can resolve historical grievances. So this matters geopolitically because India and Pakistan do not merely contest borders or doctrines. They contest narratives, and narratives, once internalized by millions, harden into the political constants that no amount of diplomatic ingenuity can easily loosen. So the counter-terrorism logic embedded in Dhurandhar is seductive precisely because it dispenses with patience. It rejects the dull procedural work that actually prevents attacks, intelligence sharing, financial tracking, policy reforms, community trust, and replaces this with a visceral fantasy of penetration and punishment. So the enemy is not disrupted, he is annihilated. The state does not deter quietly, it announces its potency theatrically. Pakistan is not portrayed as a state with factions, fractures, or internal debates, but as a unified moral space of menace, gangland, terror camps, an intelligent apparatus folded into a single hostile organism. Karachi is rendered as a perpetual inferno. Lahari becomes a mystic arena of savagery rather than a real neighborhood with a political and social history of its own. So this this flattening performs an important geopolitical function. It eliminates ambiguity. When the adversary is imagined as irredeemably violent, negotiations becomes not merely impractical but immoral. The diplomacy begins to look like appeasement. Restraint becomes cowardice in this moral universe. Escalation is not a tragic necessity. Such storytelling does not cause wars, but it changes the emotional weather in which wars become thinkable. So when a society grows accustomed to seeing its neighborhood as a permanent battlefield, it narrows its own strategic imagination. The future becomes a repetition of grievance endlessly restaged. This is especially dangerous in a nuclearized environment. That is telling that the fantasy in Dhurandhar is reserved for Pakistan and not China. China is the more formidable strategic competitor, the actor that truly shapes India's long-term security environment. Yet China resists this kind of cinematic treatments. It's too powerful, too systematic, too intertwined with India's economy to be reduced to a villain who can be humiliated by a lone hero. So the choice reveals something uncomfortable. India's popular geopolitics still prefers enemies it can dominate symbolically rather than competitors. It must confront intellectually. China requires stories about technology, logistics, industries, capacity, influence operations, and endurance. Pakistan allows stories about revenge. So, from a purely geopolitical standpoint, Dhurandhar sends three messages. First, it signals to domestic audience that kinetic action is the most desirable. This raises the political cost of de-escalation. Second, it communicates to Pakistan that India's public imagination has little interest in reconciliation or nonsense. Even if policymakers retain space for back channels and crisis management. So the cultural backdrop becomes increasingly unforgiving. Third, it tells the wider region something subtle, that Indian power is not only material but narrative. That India is willing to project its version of reality outward, even at the expense of factual accuracy or regional sensitivities. So the fact that the film faced resistance bans in parts of the Gulf underscores that other states do not see this as neutral entertainment. They read it as populist political messaging. So perhaps the most troubling aspects of the Durandar is not what it says about Pakistan, but what it suggests about India's own democratic reflexes. The hostility directed at critics, accusations of disloyalty, campaigns of harassment indicates a shrinking tolerance for dissent in matters framed as national security. This is geopolitically relevant. So states that cannot argue with themselves tend to confuse performance with power. The subcontinent does not lack for real threats. Terrorism remains a grave challenge. Pakistan's internal contradictions continue to spill across borders. China's strategic pressure is real and sustained. None of this requires mythologizing violence or turning cinema into a rehearsal for permanent hostility. What Dhurandhar ultimately signifies is a shift from tragedy to melodrama. And how could conflict is imagined? Tragedy allows for loss, ambiguity and restraint. Melodrama demands violence, moral clarity and cathartic ending. The danger is that melodrama, once internalized, begins to shape expectations of real policy. We are not started by films. Wars are not started by films. But wars are easier to justify when societies have already learned to cheer them in the dark. And that more than box office numbers or controversies is the geopolitical significance of this film. Thank you very much.